Chapter 32, wherein the happiness of Oliver and his friends experiences a sudden check. Spring flew swiftly by, and summer came, and if the village had been beautiful at first, it was now in the full glow and luxuriance of its richness. The great trees, which had looked shrunken and bare in the earlier months, had now burst into strong life and health, and stretching forth their green arms over the thirsty ground, converted open and naked spots into choice nooks, where was a deep and pleasant shade from which to look upon the wide prospect, steeped in sunshine, which lay stretched out beyond. The earth had donned her mantle of brightest green, and shed her richest perfumes abroad. It was the prime and vigor of the year, and all things were glad and flourishing. Still the same quiet life went on at the little cottage, and the same cheerful serenity prevailed among its inmates. Oliver had long since grown stout and healthy, but health or sickness made no difference in his warm feelings to those about him, though they do in the feelings of a great many people, and he was still the same gentle, attached, affectionate creature that he had been when pain and suffering had wasted his strength, and he was dependent for every slight attention and comfort on those who tended him. One beautiful night they had taken a longer walk than was customary with them, for the day had been unusually warm, and there was a brilliant moon, and a light wind had sprung up, which was unusually refreshing. Rose had been in high spirits too, and they had walked on in merry conversation until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie was fatigued, and they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air, and as she played it, they heard her sob as if she were weeping. "Rose, my dear," said the elder lady. Rose made no reply, but played a little quicker, as though the sound had roused her from some painful thoughts. "Rose, my love," cried Mrs. Maylie, rising hastily and bending over her. "What is this? Your face is bathed in tears. My dear child, what distresses you?" "Nothing, aunt, nothing," replied the young lady. "I don't know what it is. I can't describe it, but I feel so low tonight, and—" "Not ill, my love," interposed Mrs. Maylie. "No, no, oh, not ill," replied Rose, shuddering as though some deadly chillness were passing over her while she spoke. "At least I shall be better presently. Close the window, pray." Oliver hastened to comply with the request, and the young lady, making an effort to recover her cheerfulness, strove to play some livelier tune. But her fingers dropped powerless on the keys, and covering her face with her hands, she sank upon a sofa and gave vent to the tears which she was now unable to repress. "My child," said the elder lady, folding her arms around her, "I never saw you thus before." "I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose, "but indeed I have tried very hard, and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt." She was indeed, for when candles were brought, they saw that in the very short time which had elapsed since their return home, the hue of her countenance had changed to a marble whiteness. Its expression had lost nothing of its beauty, but yet it was changed, and there was an anxious, haggard look about that gentle face which it had never worn before. Another minute, and it was suffused with a crimson flush, and a heavy wildness came over the soft blue eye. Again this disappeared like the shadow thrown by a passing cloud, and she was once more deadly pale. Oliver, who watched the old lady anxiously, observed that she was alarmed by these appearances, and so in truth was he, but seeing that she affected to make light of them, he endeavored to do the same, and they so far succeeded that when Rose was persuaded by her aunt to retire for the night, she was in better spirits, and appeared even in better health, and assured them that she felt certain she would wake in the morning quite well. "I hope, ma'am," said Oliver when Mrs. Maylie returned, "that nothing serious is the matter. Miss Maylie doesn't look well tonight, but—" The old lady motioned him not to speak, and sitting herself down in a dark corner of the room, remained silent for some time. At length she said, in a trembling voice, "I hope not, Oliver. I have been very happy with her for some years, too happy perhaps, and it may be time that I should meet with some misfortune, but I hope it is not this." "What misfortune, ma'am?" inquired Oliver. "The heavy blow," said the old lady almost inarticulately, "of losing the dear girl who has so long been my comfort and happiness." "Oh, no, God forbid!" exclaimed Oliver hastily. "Amen to that, my child," said the old lady, wringing her hands. "Surely there is no danger of anything so dreadful," said Oliver. "2 hours ago she was quite well." "She is very ill now," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "and will be worse, I am sure. My dear, dear Rose, oh, what should I do without her?" The lady sank beneath her despondent thoughts, and gave way to such great grief that Oliver, suppressing his own emotion, ventured to remonstrate with her and to beg earnestly that for the sake of the dear young lady herself she should be more calm. And consider, ma'am, said Oliver, as the tears forced themselves into his eyes, despite his efforts to the contrary. Oh, consider how young and good she is, and what pleasure and comfort she gives to all about her. I am sure, certain, quite certain, that for your sake, who are so good yourself, and for her own, and for the sake of all she makes so happy, she will not die. God will never let her die yet. Hush, said Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand on Oliver's head. You think like a child, poor boy, and although what you say may be natural, it is wrong. But you teach me my duty notwithstanding. I had forgotten it for a moment, Oliver, and I hope I may be pardoned, for I am old and have seen enough of illness and death to know the pain they leave to those behind. I have seen enough, too, to know that it is not always the youngest and best who are spared to those that love them. But this should give us comfort rather than sorrow, for heaven is just, and such things teach us impressively that there is a far brighter world than this, and that the passage to it is speedy. God's will be done, but I love her, and he alone knows how well. Oliver was surprised to see that as Mrs. Maylie said these words, she checked her lamentations as though by one struggle, and, drawing herself up as she spoke, became quite composed and firm. He was still more astonished to find that this firmness lasted, and that under all the care and watching which ensued, Mrs. Maylie was ever ready and collected, performing all the duties which devolved upon her steadily, and to all external appearance even cheerfully. But he was young, and did not know what strong minds are capable of under trying circumstances. How should he, indeed, when their possessors so seldom know themselves? An anxious night ensued, and when morning came, Mrs. Maylie's predictions were but too well verified. Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. We must be active, Oliver, and not give way to useless grief, said Mrs. Maylie, laying her finger on her lip as she looked steadily into his face. This letter must be sent with all possible expedition to Mr. Losberne. It must be carried to the market town, which is not more than 4 miles off by the footpath down across the fields, and thence dispatched by an express on horseback straight to Chertsey. The people at the inn will undertake to do this, and I can trust you to see it done, I know. Oliver could make no reply, but looked his anxiety to be gone at once. Here is another letter, said Mrs. Maylie, pausing to reflect, but whether to send it now or wait until I see how Rose goes on, I scarcely know. I would not forward it unless I feared the worst. Is it for Chertsey too, ma'am? Inquired Oliver, impatient to execute his commission, and holding out his trembling hand for the letter. No, replied the old lady, giving it to him mechanically. Oliver glanced at it and saw that it was directed to Harry Maylie, Esquire, at some lord's house in the country, where he could not make out. Shall it go, ma'am? Asked Oliver, looking up impatiently. I think not, replied Mrs. Maylie, taking it back. I will wait until tomorrow. With these words she gave Oliver her purse, and he started off without more delay, at the greatest speed he could muster. Swiftly he ran across the fields and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them, now almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging into an open field, where the mowers and haymakers were busy at their work. Nor did he stop once, save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath, until he emerged in a great heat, and covered with dust on the little market-place of the market town. Here he paused and looked about for the inn. There was a white bank, and a red brewery, and a yellow town hall, and in one corner of a large house with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of the George, to which he hastened directly and caught his eye. Oliver spoke to a postboy who was dozing under the gateway, and who, after hearing what he wanted, referred him to the hostler, who, after hearing all that he had to say again, referred him to the landlord, who was a tall gentleman in a blue neckcloth, a white hat, drab breeches, and boots with tops to match, and was leaning against a pump by the stable door, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. This gentleman walked with much deliberation to the bar to make out the bill, which took a long time making out, and after it was ready and paid, a horse had to be saddled and a man to be dressed, which took up 10 good minutes more. Meanwhile, Oliver was in such a desperate state of impatience and anxiety that he felt as if he could have jumped upon the horse himself and galloped away full tear to the next stage. At length all was ready, and the little parcel having been handed up, with many injunctions and entreaties for its speedy delivery, the man set spurs to his horse, and rattling over the uneven paving of the marketplace, was out of the town and galloping along the turnpike road in a couple of minutes. It was something to feel certain that assistance was sent for, and that no time had been lost. Oliver hurried up the inn-yard with a somewhat lighter heart, and was turning out of the gateway when he accidentally stumbled against a tall man wrapped in a cloak, who was that moment coming out at the inn door. "Ha!" cried the man, fixing his eyes on Oliver and suddenly recoiling. "What the heck is this?" "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver. "I was in a great hurry to get home and didn't see you were coming." "Death," muttered the man to himself, glaring at the boy with his large dark eyes. "Who'd have thought it? Grind him to ashes, he'd start up from the marble coffin to come in my way." "I am sorry, sir," stammered Oliver, confused by the strange man's wild look. "I hope I have not hurt you?" "Rot his bones," murmured the man, a horrible passion between his clenched teeth. "If I had only had the courage to say the word, I might have been free of him in a night." "Curses light upon your head and black death upon your heart, you imp! What are you doing here?" The man shook his fist and gnashed his teeth as he uttered these words incoherently, and advancing towards Oliver as if with the intention of aiming a blow at him, fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Oliver gasped for a moment at the fearful struggles of the madman, for such he supposed him to be, and then darted into the house for help. Having seen him safely carried into the hotel, he turned his face homewards, running as fast as he could to make up for lost time, and recalling, with a great deal of astonishment and some fear, the extraordinary behavior of the person from whom he had just parted. The circumstance did not dwell in his recollection long, however, for when he reached the cottage there was enough to occupy his mind, and to drive all considerations of self completely from his memory. Rose Maylie had rapidly grown worse, and before midnight was delirious. A medical practitioner who resided on the spot was in constant attendance upon her, and after seeing the patient, he had taken Mrs. Maylie aside and pronounced her disorder to be one of a most alarming nature. In fact, he said, it would be little short of a miracle if she recovered. How often did Oliver start from his bed that night, and stealing out with noiseless footstep to the staircase, listen for the slightest sound from the sick chamber. How often did a tremble shake his frame, and cold drops of terror start upon his brow, when a sudden trampling of feet caused him to fear that something too dreadful to think of had even then occurred. And what had been the fervency of all the prayers he had ever uttered, compared with those he poured forth now in the agony and passion of his supplication, for the life and health of the gentle creature who was tottering on the deep grave's verge? The suspense, the fearful, acute suspense of standing idly by while the life of one we dearly love is trembling in the balance, the racking thoughts that that crowd upon the mind and make the heart beat violently, and the breath come thick, by the force of the images they conjure up before it, the desperate anxiety to be doing something to relieve the pain or lessen the danger which we have no power to alleviate, and the sinking of soul and spirit which the sad remembrance of our helplessness produces, what tortures can equal these, and what reflections or efforts can, in the full tide and fever of the time, allay them? Morning came, and the little cottage was lonely and still. People spoke in whispers, anxious faces appeared at the gate from time to time, and women and children went away in tears. All the livelong day, and for hours after it had grown dark, Oliver paced softly up and down the garden, raising his eyes every instant to the sick chamber, and shuddering to see the darkened window, looking as if death lay stretched inside. Late at night Mr. Losberne arrived. "It is hard," said the good doctor, turning away as he spoke. "So young, so much beloved, but there is very little hope." Another morning the sun shone brightly as if it had looked upon no misery or care, and with every leaf and flower in full bloom about her. With life and health, and sounds and sights of joy surrounding her on every side, the fair young creature lay wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept for her in silence. There was much peace and beauty in the scene, so much of brightness and mirth in the sunny landscape, such blithesome music in the songs of the summer birds, such freedom in the rapid flight of the rook careering overhead, so much of life and joyousness in it all, that when the boy raised his aching eyes and looked about, the thought instinctively occurred to him that this was not a time for death, that Rose could surely never die when humbler things were all so glad and gay, that graves were for cold and cheerless winter, not for sunlight and fragrance. He almost thought that shrouds were for the old and shrunken, and never wrapped the young and graceful form within their ghastly folds. A knell from the church bell broke harshly on these youthful thoughts. Another, again. It was tolling for the funeral service. A group of humble mourners entered the gate, and they wore white favors, for the corpse was young. They stood uncovered by a grave, and there was a mother once, among the weeping train. But the sun shone brightly, and the birds sang on. Oliver turned homewards, thinking on the many kindnesses he had received from the young lady, and wishing that the time could come over again, that he might never cease showing her how grateful and attached he was. He had no cause for self-reproach on the score of neglect or want of thought, for he had been devoted to her service, and yet 100 little occasions rose up before him on which he fancied he might have been more zealous and more earnest, and wished he had been. We need to be careful how we deal with those about us, for every death carries with it to some small circle of survivors thoughts of so much omitted and so little done, of so many things forgotten and so many more which might have been repaired, that such recollections are among the bitterest we can have. There is no remorse so deep as that which is unavailing. If we would be spared its tortures, let us remember this in time. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylie was sitting in the little parlor. Oliver's heart sank at sight of her, for she had never left the bedside of her niece, and he trembled to think what change could have driven her away. He learned that she had fallen into a deep sleep, from which she would waken again either to recovery in life or to bid them farewell and die. They sat listening and afraid to speak for hours. The untasted meal was removed, and with looks which showed that their thoughts were elsewhere, they watched the sun as he sank lower and lower, and at length cast over sky and earth those brilliant hues which herald his departure. Their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep, and they both involuntarily darted towards the door as Mr. Losberne entered. "What of Rose?" cried the old lady. "Tell me at once. I can bear it. Anything but suspense. Tell me, please." "You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear ma'am, pray." "Let me go," gasped Mrs. Maylie. "My dear child, she is dead. She is dying." "No," cried the doctor passionately. As God is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come." The lady fell upon her knees and tried to fold her hands together, but the energy which had supported her so long fled to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sunk back into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her.